It's very nice to see a lot of your faces. So welcome to our webinar for tonight, Navigating Washington Home Appraisals. Tonight, I had the pleasure of putting together a presentation which is very relevant. You're going to get some good tips and tricks today on how I'm personally navigating the appraisal process, as well as some of the top agents in our office. And giving you some good just refresher on the 22A, specific to the form, the term 7. And going over some of more advanced topics such as Tidewater and something like that. If you're new to the business, you might have to revisit or watch this again to pick up all of the tips and tricks, or take some of the other classes or the trainings that we've offered to help you get more information about Form 22A. So let's go ahead and jump right in, Shannon. We've got a full plate today. And we're going to talk about just the confusion around the appraisal waiver of Form 22A. This, in my opinion, the Washington State contract is fairly easy and straightforward if you actually read the contract, but there's one section that always trips up brokers, and it's section 22A term, I think it's 1C, where it talks about the appraisal being less than the sales price. I get this question often, do I check the box for sale, will or will not? And for the most part, the default is actually in the best interest of the seller, not the buyer. So there is a constant struggle on negotiation. In all honesty, it really does not matter unless your buyer breaches the contract. It does not constitute a waiver if you check the box will or will not. So it's confusing because it says appraisal less than sales price, buyer's waiver of the financing contingency under paragraph 3. That's where it becomes confusing. And so this is a great example of one of our agents who was the listing, I think one of the cooperating agent, and then the text message thread that you see below was, hey Izzy, this is from an agent not with Best Choice, but super confused. And so we don't want to have agents at Best Choice Realty confused about paragraph 3C and misunderstanding, especially when they're representing their seller in a multiple offer situation. So here's how it went down. If you read the text, sorry I missed you. It's kind of loud in my background. You guys are loving text messaging. I've seen a lot of texting. Be sure you're keeping track of those text messages, screen capture them if we need them for the file. The Department of Licensing and some of the other situations that I'm dealing with are requiring more of the text threads. So if you have a this one is one I kept because it was like, wow, this is blatantly not understanding how Form 22A3C, it talks about the automatic waiver, and she appears to think that just because they check the box, that means that they waived their appraisal. And in fact, if you look at the very bottom of her text, it says it's also one of the considerations the seller had when they choose to work with you over the other attractive offers we had. So, ooh, that's not good when you have a listing agent that does not understand the provision in 3C. So just a heads up on the appraisal. These staying goof ups because they're very, very important provisions in our Washington State contract. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so the appraisal less than the sales price. This is section 7 on the 22A. And this is what addresses if the occurrence happens. Now, I've seen some of you cross this whole section off. It's not, if you're going to waive the financing contingency or waive the appraisal contingency, that would be not including Form 22A. That's what that would mean. When you cross language off, it requires initials, it requires probably a managing broker looking over what you're trying to do, because it is very confusing. Washington State law does have a Form 22A when you're using the financing contingency, and it's conditioned on appraisal, and it does allow for this back and forth. It's kind of set up like the negotiation we do with the inspection, in so much as that there is section A of 7A, 7B, and then you have that third section, which is kind of down at the bottom around line 94 through line 99. So if in generalities, just so you understand this section, term 7, if you're representing the buyer and you get that lovely phone call from the lender or from the appraiser saying, hey, we're notifying you that the appraisal is not going to come in at value, then you only have 3 days upon receipt of that appraisal to send over the Form 22AN and notify the listing agent. You must notify the listing firm as well as the listing agent. Again, it's all about delivery of notices, which is talked about in our contract. And then in section B on 7B, the seller then has 10 days to basically make a choice, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it outlines the 4 choices that the seller would have. Then after the seller has made the choice, if they do not agree to drop the price to match what the notice of low appraisal would be, if they do not, then the buyer can either continue and make up the difference, or they can back out of the contract and you're back on the market. Now, in my entire career in real estate, I've had this happen a multiple amount of times. And this is why sellers choose to utilize a listing agent who has experience and professionalism to know how to handle these types of situations, because it happens more than you can even imagine, especially in a marketplace like this. I also want to just bring your attention to the FHA and VA USDA clause that talks about the appraisal certificate. We get asked a lot in the office, do I have to use, is it okay if my buyer or seller signs the VA certificate of the certification? Yes, and the reason for that is if you're dealing with FHA or VA, it overrides some of the provisions in our negotiation process. It allows them to back out and get their earnest money if the appraisal does not come in at the value. So that is something to kind of bring your attention to as well. Next slide. So there's this constant tug of war that we're experiencing right now, and you guys are probably feeling it. I know a lot of our top producers are feeling it, where the appraisers and it's like we're going into battle, and it's like this tug of war, and it doesn't need to be that way as long as you have the right communication and you understand your role as a real estate agent and the appraiser's role as the appraiser. And where it sometimes becomes a tug of war or a battle is, well, I found comps. I hear a lot of the agents talk, well, my comps are not the same as what the appraiser found, and the appraiser found comps that were 7 months old, where my comparables or my comps were only a month old. Again, I hear a lot of this, and so you need to understand and take a step back, especially if you run into these types of back and forth tug of war games with appraisers, and understand that the CMA is merely a guide to help the seller and the buyer work out a price. It's often in an open market, the buyer is going to make an offer. It's usually based on the CMA, and the buyer then is prepared to pay fair market value for the home. The buyer receives financing, and 95% of the deals that we do in Washington State require an appraiser due to the mortgage federal requirement. So when you're pricing a home, and this is where I see a lot of sellers go, okay, well, I priced the home, I priced it below market value, I had a bidding war, and then as a listing agent, maybe I didn't do such a good job for my seller, because what we found out is we included the 22A, which had the appraisal condition or the contingency in it, and then it created basically a bid up, and now the appraiser can't support the increased price. And that's oftentimes what I see when we see the notice of low appraisal, and that's why you need to consider, maybe I need a different strategy if you're running into that often. Now, if the bank's appraiser is ordered by, it's ordered by an AMC, and I'll explain what that is for some of those of you that are newer, but there are federal guidelines that have to be followed. And so there's a difference between what a CMA versus the bank appraisal. CMAs, we're going to usually find sold, pending, active. It's going to range. Some of you find 3 sold, some of you find 2 sold, some of you find pending, some of you don't even find actives. But everything we find is usually under 180 days. Unless you're dealing with commercial, which commercial you may be looking at a year or 2, depending on what you're trying to make those comparables and utilize some of those types of strategies. But generally with residential real estate, you're dealing with under 180 days. It's conducted by you. If you do not adjust your comparables, say you just went out and averaged them out, in my opinion, your CMA is no better than an online generator or a bank e-appraisal, something like that. It's no different. So you can make that difference, or that distinguish yourself from, say, an appraiser when you talk with your sellers, to let them know that here are the comparables that I selected, And much like an appraiser, I have found three solid comparables, or three sold solid comparables, and adjusted them appropriately based on the condition, based on the square footage, based on garage or the size or the type, to make sure that I have the right comparables, the ones that the appraiser would pick. And if you've done that right, you're not going to have as much trouble in identifying or negotiating or having that tug of war, that struggle with an appraiser if you are doing that. You make sure that you want to help the seller choose the listing price. And the buyers sometimes come to you and say, we're going to be in a bidding war. Rochelle, what do you think about my offer, my strategy? How far should I go up? And we use a CMA in that type of manner. Whereas in a bank appraisal, really the seller's motivation, I've had appraisers where they didn't really care if there were multiple offers. At the end of the day, they are obligated by the bank that has hired them. And you could make the debate that, hey, they're hired by the buyer, but they're hired by the buyer and the lender, honestly. And even though the buyer's paying for it. So it cannot be quantified sometimes. And I've had a brawl with some appraisers saying, we had multiple offers. There's nothing on the market, say in a 1 mile radius, and that doesn't work for some appraisers. So it is kind of, you would say, the luck of the draw, but again, it comes down to the buyer and seller motivation. An appraiser has a hard time quantifying fast moving markets, for example. There are federally mandated, they're not state mandated. So if you have a problem with the appraiser, in Washington, back a few years ago, we had trouble with getting appraisers. There was not enough of them in Washington. That soon is cleared up. But we couldn't complain to the state. We actually had to complain to the federal government to get more appraisers in our state activated. And they did lighten up some of the load, and they changed some standards so that we could not have the backlog, but we do have a backlog now. The appraisals are conducted by an appraisal management company. So I told you guys I had run into a very experienced appraiser. He was in his, don't get me wrong, it's like 79 or 80 years old. He didn't want to tell me his age, but he was around there. And he's been doing appraisals for a very long time. And we had a very frank, honest conversation when we were at one of my appraisals recently. And I mean, he didn't even have a key to access the property. So he was one of those old school appraisers that literally measured with the measuring tape, did not use any electronic devices, but he was very knowledgeable about how appraisals are conducted. And we had a very candid conversation about the appraisal management companies. And so just general knowledge for some of you who are new to the business, appraisal management companies are third-party sources where a lot of appraisers belong to, and that's how they get their jobs. And so he told me, it was like shocking when he told me, he says, Rochelle, I get 12 to 15 appraisal requests per day, and I deny each one of them. And the reason I deny them is because either A, they're out of the area where I don't want to specialize. He's an older gentleman, so I can understand where he's coming from. B, he says most commonly the reason I reject them is because they're not willing to pay me what I'm worth. The lender goes into the appraisal management company's website or their portal or whatever you want to call it, and they end up indicating how much they're willing to pay or how much they've contracted with that buyer to pay for that appraisal. So if you're dealing with, say, an online company or an online lender, you know the names, the Rocket Mortgages of the world, that type of system, they may have only a certain amount they're willing to put up on the AMC portal. And then what happens is those appraisers get picked up by appraisals. And sometimes, I hate to say it, but some of those appraisers, they go through, just like this guy who's very experienced, and is like, okay, I'm gonna pick my day. Do I want to get paid for that appraiser that I have to drive like an hour away to do and only get paid $500? Or do I want to go for the $750 or the $1,000 appraisal where it's in my backyard and I know I just did a duplex, say, just about a month ago. So I've already got my basis or my work, kind of preliminary work done. You have a lot of that going on behind the scenes that you as real estate agents need to understand is happening. So the appraiser approach is basically once they get the order, once my guy gets the order, he has to decide, should I use a sales comparison approach, the income approach, or the cost approach? And depending if I'm dealing with commercial, multifamily, or a tear down, or a property that's conventional or FHA, most of the time they're going to use with residential the sales comparison approach. And as you can see from this slide, they want 3 confirmed closed sales. This is right from the VA handbook. So if you're going to look at what the VA is doing, most of the time FHA is doing the same and conventional is doing the same as well. So if you go off of this kind of approach as a real estate agent going, I need to find 3 closed sales. If I don't want to have hassles anymore with my appraisals not coming in at value, at least find 3 closed sales, some really good comparables that will justify the market price that I'm listing my home. If you can't find the 3, then you can see there's additional current sales that could be required, or the lender may require underwriter, like the 6-month range. If I found one, it's past the 6-month range, or when the adjustments they can't exceed 15%. These are some clues for you as real estate agents too, as you're doing your adjustments on CMAs. Or if there's significant adjustments, or in the other thing that just drives me up the wall in our area is when the appraiser, and this is a sign that I usually see of an appraiser who doesn't know what they're doing. I'm just going to be blunt tonight, where they indicate, for example, in Tacoma, that Tacoma is a declining market. I found that on 2 appraisers report in the last 2 months, which does not make any sense to me. So when that stuff happens, there are ways to combat it, but it becomes a lot harder to do it once that appraiser has been assigned. So there are 2 really good articles that you guys can take a look at if you are like me and you want to stay up on the what's going on in the appraiser world. August 5th was the most recent article that I thought was really, really good and timely from the Realtor magazine, and it was Appraisers Struggle to Manage the Skyrocketing Demand, and how the pandemic is changing appraisals by the Realtor magazine. So I subscribe to those 2 articles, and just the key takeaways are these bullet points that I have here on the screen. Their historic mortgage rates, they're super, super low. In fact, I just got another email yesterday that they're at another historic low rate. So that's creating longer turnaround times for appraisers. The underwriting process is becoming a bit more strained. And so you need to set up more expectations with your clients and have more communication with your lenders. If you're not doing that, you're going to run into problems with your deals. We've already seen deals push from August to September, many of them because of the underwriting process or the appraisal process. In the article about the pandemic is changing appraisals, the writer actually did a kind of an interview with 35 different real estate brokers across the nation. And out of 35 that she spoke with, 10 out of 35 were consistently having appraisals that were coming under value. And it's just kind of annoying, really, when they come in under value around $3,000 to $4,000. That's what she claimed is the average. And now their appraisers are looking to not only get paid more to come out and do a second appraisal, and sometimes, but the parties have to negotiate that $3,000 or $4,000 off of that sales price or that market price. So it's super frustrating for all of the people. That's where you see real estate brokers kicking in commission. And that's not fun, especially when you're all the way 3/4 of the way through the file and then you find out your appraisal did not come in at value. There are times where they are doing drive-bys and desktop appraisals. It's very rare right now in Washington, especially since we are doing it with restriction. We're kind of using precautions when we are showing properties. The appraisers are doing the same thing as well. If you are seeing 20% down or 50% down, many of those appraisals are usually drive-bys, or they are actually done without their appraisal waivers. So you may want to ask the buyer's agent about that, if that is a consideration by that particular lender, or you can call the lender directly. If you're using a company like Movement Mortgage, I could call Sam and say, Sam, this guy's putting 25% down. And is his credit good enough that he could actually get the desktop appraisal or get it waived? And Sam might be able to tell me that based on what he's putting into his system. Remember, the lender goes into the AMC portal and actually indicates, what is the cost of the appraisal, or what is the company going to charge, and when is that expected timeline? When do you need that appraisal done by? They're the ones that put that in. They have no way of communicating with the appraiser directly, but they go into the appraisal management company and put in those requests. So the real estate agent, that's also discussed in the article, is should the real estate agent be present for the appraisal? And I can give you many different instances where it might make sense to be present, or to send comparables to the appraiser, or to provide them with information. I would lean on the latter, which is providing them with information. I'll talk about that in a minute, but just quick point, just don't forget, this is an example of what that FHA and VA amendatory clause would look like. It comes across probably about 3/4 of the way into your transaction. And many of you ask me, Rochelle, what is this? Can I sign it? Can I have my buyer sign it? You actually have to sign it as an agent as well. So it's not just signed by buyer and seller. It's basically an amendatory clause that amends the contract in such a way where it allows that FHA, that government, or that VA, that veteran, to exit the contract if the appraisal does not come in at the value. That is what you're agreeing to participate in by signing. So best tips for real estate agents: definitely want to have professional communication with all the parties. I don't want to see text messages like I've seen in the past. Hopefully it's not from Best Choice agents. I've trained you much better than that. But we want to have good communications. Many of you ask me, is it okay for me to contact the appraiser? Is it okay for me to contact the lender? Is it okay for me to contact that client? You cannot contact the other client unless you're unable to get a hold of the other agent for whatever reason and have contacted me. But your respective client, the appraiser, the lender, yes, you can contact all of those parties. There's no provision that says you cannot. And especially when you're trying to understand where the appraiser is coming from. And we've been able to overcome a lot. And sometimes we have to concede as real estate brokers that, you know what, there's just not the sold comparables to justify the appraisal coming in at that value. Or, you know, there is guidelines that have to be followed by going to FHA or VA. And so you want to have that professional communication. One of the good tips that I would give you, and I use this with this experienced guy, he goes, it was kind of cute. We showed up at the house. I was there on time. He showed up about 5 minutes later. I opened the house, you know, used my key, just kind of chit-chatting along the way. I said, how long have you been doing this? He's like, very long time. As you can see, I'm quite old. And I said, well, I'm not going to ask how old you are. We're just kind of chit-chatting. And then as we got to the front of the house, I let him know right off the bat. I said, so to save him time, because I know he's got to measure, and obviously I want to save myself some time as well. But I showed him where the attic access was, where the water heater straps were, you know, I showed him where that was, and the smoke detectors, because every single appraiser is going to need that. At a minimum, you're going to need to show them or provide CO or smoke detectors, 2 water heater straps, make sure that they have a full copy of the contract. I mentioned as we walked in the house, I said, did you get a full copy of the contract? And did you also see in the contract where we agreed as the listing agent or the sellers to put on a new roof? And he said, yes, I did see that. Thank you so much. He said, have you got a bid yet for that? I said, actually I have. I've got a few bids ranging from $12,000 to $15,000. He's like, fantastic. That's all he needed for his research. That helped him do his job. That's an example of me calling or talking with the appraiser and making sure that he had what he needed to do his evaluation. Now, another best tip that I could say you could do is make sure that you are cutting down timelines or delivering the 22AL and the AP, depending on if you represent the buyer or the seller. Many of you have started doing that, and I think that's best practice, especially when things are getting delayed. If you're not delivering the 22AL and then 22AP, you're not working that out, you probably want to go back and look and make sure. What happened to me was that, and this has happened to a few of our brokers in the last 30 days, is because the appraisers are so backed up, what's happening is that the 22AL, maybe you didn't do it, you're like, oh, let's just bypass it, let's blow through the timelines on the 22A. So I failed to deliver the 22AL and 22AP, or the 22AR for that matter. And then all of a sudden, a week before closing, we find out the appraiser has never picked up the appraisal. And now you're looking at an extension because they're backlogged, and you find out that the buyer is going to have to pay a rush fee of say $1,500 or $1,800 just to have an appraiser in the queue or in the AMC pick up the job. So never fun to get that phone call, never fun to be on the buyer side or the listing side. And so what we were kind of talking about in the office last week is that if you are representing a seller, this may help you. And again, this may not help in every situation. I would definitely go with number 2 before I have to employ number 3. But let's say that the seller has a strict deadline that they have to make, where they actually have to be out of their house on a certain date, and they want to make sure that that lender or that appraiser and underwriter get that appraisal through that that first couple weeks, that we're not waiting in the queue in the AMC for somebody to pick it up and having to pay thousands of dollars. The seller can incentivize. I got a permission from Movement Mortgage. They would be fine with this. I don't know about other lenders, but if we wrote this into a 22D other section, it would perfectly be okay. So if you represent a seller, you can pay the appraiser through the form of the contract to incentivize the appraiser turnaround time, so that the underwriter or the appraiser would actually know that the seller is crediting the buyer $250 toward the buyer's appraisal rush fee. And that might help that buyer or that buyer's agent go, gosh, my seller is serious about actually helping me get that appraisal ordered. Generally $750, and I confirmed that with this experienced appraiser, $750 is kind of the average right now. So if you're a buyer's agent and you're like trying to figure out, why is this appraisal not picked up? It's been a week. It's been a week after the inspection. Whatever that may be, you can simply contact your lender and just say, hey, just wanted to check in. Did you put up the amount of the fee? How much are you willing to pay that appraiser in the system? And they tell you only $500. Well, maybe it might need to kick in earlier than waiting until the day before closing or the week before closing to get that rush fee done. You may have to work together between you and the other agent. Again, we've done some creative things at Best Choice Realty to help our buyers and our sellers meet those required deadlines, wherein you have homes that are moving from point to point. The communication from the appraiser to the agent, I know I'm running low on time, but this is an example of what Tidewater is. And for those of you who don't know what, my first one that I got, I was like, I didn't even know what Tidewater was. I'd have to go back to my appraisal class that I took maybe 2 renewals ago. So you have to understand what Tidewater is. What Tidewater is mean that the appraiser has done a preliminary workup and they have not been able to find comparables to support the value. And so what they're asking you to do is to provide that for them. And so this is an example of an email that I received, and it was weird because it came in like very text format, very formal, and obviously very short. This is the entire email. I almost missed it. I almost thought it was junk. So be on the lookout as a listing agent or a buyer's agent if the appraiser invokes what they call Tidewater. And it came in 2017. Again, it was a fast moving market in 2017. And the lender, so it has it's automatically populated, lender has until April 17th to provide data to support the sales price. And then I got a copy of this. Go to the next slide, Shannon. We'll go to the next slide, one more. I got this format. It was attached from the lender. This is an email that I did get from the lender. Every lender has their own reconsideration of value grid form. You may have to provide this if you're the listing agent or the buyer's agent, and it goes into detail. Here's the subject, here's comp 1, here's comp 2, here's comp 3. It's extremely irritating when you have a Tidewater called out and you realize that it's just the luck of the draw. It's whatever appraiser picked up the deal and they decided they didn't want to find comparables, because most of the time I can find comparables and we can fill out this grid fairly simply. But if you get called out on your first Tidewater and you need some help, reach out to me, reach out to Jerry Kay. We've dealt with these things before, and we can strategize or say, here's what you need to do, or contact the lender and let's give them this comparable or that comparable. Not all of the lenders have this nice grid. If you want a copy of this grid, this might be helpful just to kind of practice if you're working on what should I adjust, how should I adjust, because you're basically doing their job for them a little bit here. Okay. And then negotiating with it, go back 1.5 steps, Shan. There we go, the quicken loans. If anytime you're dealing with a online mortgage company, you got to realize every mortgage company participates in an average of around 3 or 4 AMCs, meaning that they have 3 different systems that can go in and order the appraisal through. And in the AMC, there's probably 50 to 75, maybe more, appraisers that are in or are involved with that particular appraisal management company. So think of it as like a third party where you're going in and you kind of get what you pay for. So sometimes when you go with a mortgage broker that's not local, that's not established with AMCs where the appraisals come through nicely, oftentimes you have trouble. And most of the time I'm having trouble with the online companies. So although you might save on paper when you start the process, maybe Quicken Loans was a 1/4 point difference. But if we go with, say, a second opinion and we double app, like I encourage a lot of my especially my Quicken loans, sometimes they do a better job, you know, honestly, when it but really comes down to it, when I'm ready to order the inspection, get the inspection appraisal done, then I have this nice conversation with my client and say, we don't have to order the appraisal. Do you want to order the appraisal with Quicken, or do you want to order it with Movement, for example? And Movement may have a better, you know, they'll order it through an AMC. The Quicken has a completely different AMC they order it through. And you'll have most likely a different appraiser for each company. So sometimes it's not as good of a deal if you can't get the appraisal to come in at value. So you may want to think about that when you're strategizing with your client on which mortgage company do I want to go with. And I have had more trouble. This is an example of what they'll send you. It's advance notice that the appraisal is going to come in under the purchase price. I'm attaching a grid for comps. You could switch gears if you wanted to, but then you got to realize you're going to order from a different AMC, different appraiser. If the appraiser hasn't gone in or there hasn't been money exchanged, most likely with this scenario, there's been money exchange where the buyer is actually having to pay up front for many of these appraisals. $750 is not cheap. So just understand where your timelines are, and that you got to understand the process that is going through a third party, and there's no way once you get through the AMC that you actually can control it. It's already through that process. And that's all I have for tonight. I'm sure I opened up a lot of, I opened up Pandora's box for some questions. I'd be happy to answer a few questions if you have some, Shannon. If you want to chat, you're welcome to, or just go ahead and we'll unmute the line. *6 to unmute if you want to speak. A good question. Somebody said, does the Cloud CMA have, and we do have access for those of you who are jumping on tonight and you're newer, I do have a Cloud CMA account that you can use to make those adjustments and really do a good job on your CMA. Just get with me and I'll be happy to provide you with that information. There also is 2 helpful PDFs that are included in that Cloud CMA account that might help some of your newer sellers, if they're new to selling their home, understand the difference between a CMA and an appraisal to maybe give you a leg up on your competition who may not do a good job on their CMA. So Shannon can send that in the goodies tomorrow. Any other questions, Shannon?
Nothing that came through the chats, but feel free to unmute your line.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Emily.
So which is better to vary from, back in time or broader in distance? That's question 1. And then 2, I know really that appraisers use, like, for example, split levels. Do they have to have all the solds be the exact same split level, or can they use one? Or, you know, if we're not finding the exact,
yes,
you know what I'm saying?
they should be using the same style code. So you shouldn't see appraisers that have 2 stories compared with ramblers. You should not see a split level compared with a rambler. I mean, those are, they're not the same buyer. So you'll have some debate with appraisers with something like that. But to answer your first question, when it comes to distance, or you said property type?
Time.
Time. Okay, so distance or time, it's going to depend on the appraiser you get. And that's hard to stomach. So I've kind of battled that. I would tend to think proximity is more important than time.
Okay, and then when we're running our own CMAs in order to know, like, where to list a house, let's say, I try to list them closer to where I really think they're going to list, because I think that there's room for less, you know, complications. But so what should we do if there's not enough, let's say, tri-levels? Do we go broader in distance, or compare them to?
You could go out, you know, instead of being a mile, you could go 1.5 miles or 2 miles and try to find a tri-level. Or you could find something that's closer in, maybe that's like, say, 9 months or a year, and then make the adjustment for the time on market. That's a lot of times what appraisers will do, is they'll go, they'll keep it within the neighborhood and the same style, but then they'll adjust for the time on market.
How do we know what calculation to use on that? Like a percentage of previous sale or what?
Yeah, it's usually, you look at the average, the equity position over the year, and you can get that from the MLS.
Okay.
It's pretty easy to do that adjustment. But if you need help, that's what I'm here for.
Thanks.
Mhm.
It looks like David had a question. How long does it take for the lender to confirm a date of an appraisal?
They have a portal. Every lender I've spoken with where it's like, what's going on? Why hasn't the appraisal been picked up? Many times they'll have to go into their portal and actually log into their portal and figure out, oh, we only put up $600 and now I just increased it to $700 to get it picked up. It's usually, I mean, it's like a portal like any other piece of technology. It shouldn't take long for that lender to confirm the date of the appraisal. I would expect like a 1 or 2 day turn time, not including the weekend. And then the best to get the contact information for the appraiser. And it's funny because the lender cannot provide that. So what I will do is when an appraiser calls me, say I'm in an appointment and they leave me a voicemail, I will log that in my phone just so I have their contact information, because the lender, it's sometimes very difficult to get the name and phone number of the appraiser. That takes just sometimes long enough. So they should put yourself, if you're the listing agent, I put both the listing agent and the buyer's agent's phone number on, for appraisal, letting the lender know that, hey, they can contact either me or the buyer's agent to get access to the property. That often helps that back and forth. And it's frustrating for appraisers that I've heard that real estate agent never contacted them back. And it's super frustrating because they only make a certain amount of money. Once they pay the AMC, a portion of that appraisal fee, they'll make a basic type of appraisal fee on some of these things. Some of them take losses. I was like shocked when he told me that when this appraiser told me how many appraisals he denied every single day just due to the cost. It was crazy. So, I mean, they usually know fairly quickly whether they're going to accept it or not. And it's all about the money, how much money is put up in how those appraisals are picked up. So it has a lot to do with geography, the complexity of the appraisal and whether it gets picked up by an appraiser on the AMC. And honestly, it comes down to the money right now because they're so backlogged. Okay. Contact information. There's a list of the AMC. I mean, if you knew the AMC, they're all listed under the AMC. That's how I've had one underwriter as they were getting licensed in Washington. Like, Rochelle, here's a list of 70, here 3 or 4 different AMCs, and do you see some names on these lists that are recognizable? Or do you see the names that we don't want to use? And trust me, I have a list of about 10 to 15 appraisers that I will never use because of bad behavior at an appraisal, just not understanding how appraisals are done. There are bad appraisals, but there certainly are bad real estate agents as well. So again, it comes back to that tug of war on how we treat that other affiliated business. Okay, anything else, Shannon, that came through? Okay, you guys have a great week. Let's hope and pray for some rain this week. I'm looking forward to seeing some raindrops at my house. And we'll catch you on Thursday. Don't forget, we have a Thursday social media call that will be really good. Wendy Luntis does a fantastic job of educating. If you guys want to make time for that, it's at 10 a.m. on Thursday. And I will be sending out a reminder on Thursday, probably Wednesday night, Thursday morning as well. So you guys can jump on that call. Should be a good one to get well versed. Thanks again, Shannon. Thanks, everyone.